So he's Syngman Rhee's new right hand. What, huh? In the 1890s, he commuted the death sentence of Syngman Rhee? Say what? Wow. No, I didn't know. No. Okay. Yeah. 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 See it. August 11th, 1952. Siberia. It's a huge place, but it's also a very little place. And this week, that's where the fight is. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the UN forces managed to take Old Baldy from the Chinese and began reinforcing it, while in the skies there was another big bombing raid on Pyongyang, the North Korean capital. There is some limited ground pressure being applied by the UN forces this week, actually, and it seems likely that this month will feature a few small-scale yet bitter battles for favorable terrain. On the 9th, a few kilometers east of Panmunjom, elements of the 1st Marine Division managed to provoke a Chinese attack that takes an outpost on Hill 58. After that, until today, that outpost changes hands 5 times. But then the Chinese managed to take it and hold it. The outpost is known as Siberia to the Marines, and the Chinese hit it just after midnight the 9th. Since Siberia is like halfway between the main line of resistance and the Chinese outpost, holding it would give them a better observation point for artillery and mortar guidance to strike the UN's Jamestown line. You know what? Here's a little more detail. The Marines around here are from Colonel Walter Layer's 1st Marine Regiment, and the Chinese also probed their positions that night, which are towards the right of the Marine Division's lines. Company E, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines does the counterattacking, but the Chinese mortars and big guns from Hills 110 and 120 stop them. The Marines then call in airstrikes on the outpost before they counterattack again. At 6:50 a.m., F-9F jets from the 1st Marine Air Wing hit it with napalm and 500-pound bombs. 3 hours later, Air Force F-80 jets hit it with 1,000-pound bombs, and a platoon from the Marine Regimental Reserve joins a platoon from Company E in storming the hill, and they managed to take the crest. They try organizing defenses there, but Chinese firepower drives them off mid-afternoon. Roughly 75% of the Marines who go up the hill are killed or wounded. The survivors reorganize, and Company C gets the call to try next, which they do with 2 platoons a while after midnight that night. After 4 hours of fighting, they too manage to take the crest of the hill, but a Chinese counterattack drives them off come the dawn. Over a period of 30 or so hours, the Marines have taken 17 killed and 243 wounded, and Colonel Layer realizes they likely won't take and hold Siberia if nearby Hill 122, nicknamed Bunker Hill, remains in enemy hands. So they plan an attack on that position, which does actually dominate Siberia and would give them better observation of the enemy in general. To achieve surprise against Bunker Hill, a diversionary attack on Siberia is launched this evening, the 11th, by one company from Lieutenant Colonel Roy Batterton's 2nd Battalion. 4 Patton tanks from the 1st Tank Battalion support this. Now, they've not only got 90mm guns, they also have shuttered searchlights to make brief, blinding target illuminations. On top of that, there are 4 flamethrower tanks lighting up the night, and the latter actually gain the crest of Siberia. Company D then holds the crest until midnight, when they have decided to end this diversion. We will see how the Bunker Hill attacks go next week. There are also attacks this week a bit further east from the 1st Marines in the 5th Marine sector. Here the fighting is somewhat different. See, there's an outpost line in front of 2nd Battalion 5th Marines consisting of 3 outposts, Elmer, Hilda, and Irene. But these are only manned by the 2nd Battalion during the day, so the night of the 6th, the Chinese just walk into Elmer, the one furthest to the southwest, and then use artillery to prevent the Marines from occupying the other 2 the next day. Today, the 11th, the Chinese also managed to occupy Hilda and now set their sights on Outpost Irene. There's even action for the ROK, South Korean troops, this week. In ROK 2nd Corps' front east of Kumsong, the ROK Capital Division has a heavy fight. See, a hill soon known as Capitol Hill overlooks their positions, and its outposts are in enemy hands. The night of the 5th, elements of the Capital Division managed to infiltrate and capture 2 of the outposts. This, however, provokes an immediate and bloody response by 2 KPA, North Korean, companies. And for 4 days, the battle tilts back and forth until the communists break off their attack the 10th, leaving 369 dead behind them and taking an estimated 450 or so further dead with them. The ROK 26 Regiment, which did a ton of the fighting, lists 48 killed and 150 wounded. They actually get a commendation for the fight from U.S. 8th Army Commander Jim Van Fleet. I've talked in earlier episodes about a sort of manpower crisis the U.S. Army is facing in 1952, since most of the men called into service for the Korean War in 1950 were becoming eligible for discharge. 750,000 men released and 650,000 raw recruits to replace them. Just training those guys uses a big chunk of Army manpower and also leaves the regular divisions within the U.S. undermanned. And the Army will have over 100,000 fewer personnel by October than it had in April. Cuts like that also require cuts in officer strength. And just FECOM, Far Eastern Command, 600 officers need to be cut because of budget limitations. FECOM and UN Commander Mark Clark very vigorously protested this earlier this summer, but G3, Operations, told him they're going through a 5% reduction on a global basis, and Korea is exempt from that FECOM total. That's all officers in Japan and the Ryukyu Islands, so it would have been more otherwise. Then, at the end of July, Operations told Clark that maybe he could decrease the number of officers he has training the Japanese Defense Forces in order to give priority to Japanese instructors from battalion level down. See, if the U.S. officers were only at the higher levels, that savings would meet most, or maybe all, of the overall shortage of officers. Clark says, yeah, that's not going to work, because the Japanese are also going to have a large turnover of personnel, theirs in late 1952 when their 2-year tours of duty finish. And on top of that, they're just about to do heavy armament training, and that completely precludes a reduction in American officer numbers for the moment. Then there's this from U.S. Army Chief of Staff Lieutenant Joe Collins. In a frank letter to Clark on the 1st of August, General Collins discussed Army personnel prospects for the year ahead, the loss of half of the strength of the Army, and the huge problem training all of the replacements, which sharply affect the status and quality of the reserve forces in the United States. Each month, Collins continued, the Army had to send 40,000 replacements overseas, and this demand could be met until November. After that, the FEC would receive its full quota, but other areas would go under strength. Collins felt that this would be a difficult period, and much would depend upon the character of leadership at all echelons if the Army were going to weather it successfully. So you kind of get from the tone that Collins figures the manpower situation is going to get worse down the line. But they are training the ROK to replace them, well, at least replace them in Korea. There's also developments in the artillery shortage issue. You may remember a few weeks ago that Collins told Clark he'd get a minimum of 5 rounds of 155mm howitzer ammunition per gun per day. Well, that hasn't sat well with Clark, and now he's authorized Van Fleet 15 rounds per day per tube, right? Collins is trying to get approval for that, and spoiler, he will later this month, but will have to curtail other allocations pretty severely to do so. Clark did ask for approval to buy 600,000 rounds of that ammunition in Japan, but the Army discovers it would cost more than 50% more than the American rate, so that doesn't fly. But now the Army has agreed to replace ammunition expended in Korea. So they're trying to get a 90-day supply at the full rate of 40 rounds per tube per day. Should this happen, then Clark will only requisition resupply based on what he's actually fired. Fascinating stuff. I mentioned training the ROK just now. A few more words on that. All the discussions and meetings between Collins, Clark, and Van Fleet have actually borne fruit. Collins has actually overruled his staff and approved a bulk of 92,100 more men and U.S. Army support for augmenting the ROK by 2 divisions. As Collins envisioned the divisional expansion, it would be progressive and fitted within current budget guidelines and availability of logistical resources. He felt it would be desirable to capitalize on the ROK capability to supply trained manpower economically and to pave the way for the eventual withdrawal and redeployment of U.S. Army forces. So, whatever the implications of adding 2 divisions to the ROK Army, its strength grows this month to more than 350,000 men. This figure, though, does not include the men of Katusa, Korean augmentation to U.S. Army, those Koreans assigned to U.S. 8th Army. And because of that, Van Fleet asks Clark to raise the number of them to a max of 27,000. Clark says, sure, and raises the ceiling to 28,000, reasoning that this will help U.S. Army strength and give those Koreans top-notch training. There are also proposals afoot to increase the number of Korean Marines, and I imagine the numbers of everything will all coalesce into something concrete in the next few weeks. Speaking of Korean numbers, the South Korean presidential elections are held this week on August 5th. Remember, President Syngman Rhee managed to get a constitutional amendment passed that made the president be elected directly by the people. It had been before that the president was chosen by the legislature, the National Assembly. But in the 1950 National Assembly elections, Rhee's party did terribly and only got like a quarter of the seats. So he did not think he could win the presidency again that way. Rhee does well now, though, getting over 5.2 million votes, which is 74.62% of the vote, easily beating 2 independents and a Democratic Nationalist Party candidate. The independent Ham Tae-young wins the vice presidency, beating out 7 other candidates, though not getting 50% of the vote. He's nearly 80 years old, and he has a checkered history. In fact, back when he was a judge in the Korean Empire before it was annexed by Japan, he reversed the death sentence of a young man named Syngman Rhee. After the annexation, he basically devoted his life to working for Korean independence, and after World War II, was both involved in the founding of South Korea and spreading Christianity in the country. He is a devout Christian. He replaces Kim Jong-soo, who has been vice president since last May, but resigned in late June because of irreconcilable differences with Syngman Rhee. A few weeks ago, I went over how the UN was bit by bit releasing the thousands of South Korean civilians that they held. But there are like 11,000 or so POWs who claim to be South Korean, and Mark Clark wants to somehow release those guys. He is told by his judge advocate that there isn't really any legal basis to do this except Article 5 of the Geneva Convention, which covers doubtful cases, right? The holding power, in this instance the UNC, could convene a competent tribunal, according to Article 5, to determine the status of these doubtful cases. If the tribunal found that these prisoners should not be classified as POWs, then they might be freed. Clark talks about this with UN Chief Delegate at the Peace Talks, William Harrison, and they figure there are 3 criteria, pretty simple ones, that must be met to release a doubtful case. Residents south of the 38th parallel before June 25, 1950, when the war began. The choice made during screening to not be sent to North Korea or China. And the guy must proclaim allegiance to the Republic of Korea. Who would make up the tribunals, though? How about American and South Korean personnel? And maybe some guys from other UN nations involved in the war, if they could swing that somehow. Should they tell the communists? And if so, what should they tell them? Well, they could just make a brief announcement explaining the legal basis for doing this, or, they could just not tell them. What if they complain about not being told when they find out what's happening? In that case, Harrison should say what he said when they decided to release the civilians they held, that it is purely an internal affair. Harrison likes this idea. We shall see what happens in a week or two, I imagine. For this week of the war is finished, with fighting for Siberia, that sounds wrong somehow, fighting for Capitol Hill, same, shortages and South Korean elections. Oh, and on August 6th, on the deck of U.S. carrier Boxer, an F-9F Panther jet explodes and starts a fire, which causes stores of gasoline and ammunition to explode. 9 of the crew are killed, and 63 are rescued from the sea by helicopters and nearby ships. 12 planes on the carrier are destroyed, but the carrier remains operational. A court of inquiry is appointed the next day by 7th Fleet Commander Jocko Clark to determine what caused the explosion to happen. They will determine that it was a failure during servicing the plane. The machine gun was not cleaned before releasing the bolt to the firing position. So, a South Korean election this week and an American one in 3 months to replace President Harry Truman, and one pretty much certain to change the conduct of the war, no matter who wins the election. Here's a quote from Clay Bear's The Forgotten War to end today with a little coverage of Harry Truman's woes. The Truman administration was under attack from many quarters. The war in Korea, which had cost more than 100,000 American casualties, remained an unresolved nightmare, mired in seemingly petty haggling at Panmunjom. While more Americans died, and American POWs suffered physical and mental torture. McCarthyism was rampant and effective. Millions of Americans did not doubt that the government, Dean Acheson's State Department in particular, was infested with communist spies, pinkos, and fellow travelers. A number of Truman's cronies and appointees had been caught with their hands in government cookie jars, creating an aura of impropriety and scandal. Public opinion polls gave Truman abysmally low approval ratings, averaging about 30%. Yep, less than a third of his country approves of his handling of affairs, particularly this war that just drags on and on. But what can the next guy do? That is the question. Hey, you guys may remember that a couple months ago I did an online lecture for the Smithsonian Associates. That was on Russia's Brusilov offensive of 1916 in World War I. Next week on the 19th at 6 p.m. Central European Time, so that's noon in New York, I guess, I'm doing a second lecture for them, which is sort of a follow-up. This is on the Romanian front in World War I. Romania joined the war in 1916, just near the end of Brusilov. If you want to check it out, which you can do, which you should do, you can register at smithsonianassociates.org, and then you just click on the calendar for August 19th, and it's easy enough after that. As for Korea, if you want me to continue to do this week by week, then join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Andre Falcone Alcalde is the Army member of the week here. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.